Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 118 of the podcast for May 10th, 2011. My guest today is Jim Womack. He was the founder of the Lean Enterprise Institute, now serves as a senior advisor to that organization. And we're continuing the discussion that we started in episode 116 that focused on his new book called Gemba Walks. Today we're talking about a broader range of issues, including the auto industry, General Motors and Toyota, where they've been and where they're going. We'll talk about a combination of Lean and Six Sigma, and we'll talk about some other topics as we go. So the podcast can be found at leanblog.org/118, and you can also go there if you'd like to post a comment or leave feedback. Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining us again and for taking time to do another podcast.
Well, thank you.
So here we're going to talk about the state of the auto industry, where it's been recently and where it's going. And I think back to my very first day as an employee at LEI in June 2009 was the exact day that General Motors filed for bankruptcy. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about General Motors in particular and where things are going.
Well, this is a big thing, GM. It's hard to turn. GM really invented modern management under Sloan back after the disaster of 1919. This 2009 bankruptcy was really the third what you really should call bankruptcy in the history of GM. One in 1910, just 2 years after it was founded, the second in 1919, and then the third in 2009. I guess looking at the bright side, it will be, 900 years until the next one or something if you work out the sequence of numbers. But part of the problem with GM is that they were so good at Sloan-style modern management. And then once that didn't work, it turned out that everything had to change. And that has been the big problem. It's not a trivial issue. That when you create a business where every manager thinks in a certain way, and you have this long, long-running union relationship that works in a certain way, and the public thinks about you in a certain way, for anyone to walk in and say, we will now all think about each other and behave toward each other and deal with our customers in a different way, this is a truly heroic challenge for anybody coming in as a sort of transformative leader. So what you can say about GM is that so far so good, that without the government getting into it, hard to know exactly what would have happened, really a big meltdown. Not a little meltdown, but they've come through that. The world is not necessarily going to be such a friendly place for car companies coming up because whatever you think of the climate issue, cars figure prominently in what people talk about doing about it. Whatever you think about oil and oil availability, cars, as we talk about it today, just overwhelmingly live on oil. And there are lots and lots of new competitors coming into the car industry, the most interesting of which are the state-owned Chinese companies. The companies that get all of the publicity are the private BYD, Brilliance, Great Wall, Geely, and so forth companies. But the ones that are just enormous, which are the venture partners of all the multinationals, are the big SAIC, First Automotive companies, that are going to have their own brands and own cars here very shortly. So this is not going to be an easy industry for anybody to flourish in. And so therefore, that's the background. Having said that, it's interesting to me that GM, I think, on the day they filed for bankruptcy, was a better company than they had ever been. That they really did fix the plants after about 2000. Took them about 15 years of fooling around before they could finally get General Motors, the global manufacturing system, to actually get traction. But they had plants as of 2009 that were actually good enough. GM did not fail because the number of hours of effort or the number of defects in their plants were not competitive. They failed because they had all these legacy costs that they just couldn't deal with. And Rick Wagner kept thinking if he could just get about another 10 years in North America, 17 million units per year, he could somehow or other get the pig through the python, which is all of those retiree and healthcare costs, and he just couldn't get there. So that was what happened to the bankruptcy was that that was greatly relieved. So now their wages are competitive with the other players in the North American industry, that their plants are good enough, not brilliant, but good enough. Their product development system is pretty good when they can get focused. And shedding all of those hopeless brands that they couldn't support is really a wonderful advantage for the product development system, because they now have less badge engineering and just fiddling around on the margins to do, and so it should be easier to get focused. Wish I could say that anything much has happened with suppliers, by the way, with any of the companies, other than they're now coming out with volume forecasts in terms of tooling that aren't just completely loony, and that's bound to make your suppliers think a little bit better of you. And then, to me, the most striking thing, and this has nothing to do with GM of itself, in fact, Toyota in some ways has the biggest problem, that the whole dealer relationship with the customer at the factory just refuses to get better. And no one seems to actually have any ideas, even though Toyota figured out how to do it in Japan 50 years ago. So, therefore, when you look at GM, you say, hey, a product development system, pretty good. Factories, good enough. Supplier relations, well, at least they won't be throwing chairs at each other as long as they're meeting their volume forecast. Dealers, GM's dealers, if you look at the power numbers in terms of customer satisfaction, are better than Toyota dealers. So that's some modest advantage GM. So, therefore, there are a lot of good things about GM. What I've written and what I write in the Gimbal Walks book is that Sloan made it so clear what GM's purpose was, which was a product for every person purpose, the customer having the purpose. And every GM product was to be slightly more refined and sophisticated than comparable products at similar points in the market. And that was Sloan's simple answer to what GM was going to do. They were going to give you a slightly better car, whoever you were, whatever your purpose, than the other guys could give you, and GM got vastly wealthy off of simply doing that. Now you say, well, what's the purpose of GM? And I just attended a lecture, that's quite the word, it was a discussion that Dan Ackerson, the new current, the latest CEO at GM, had at the Sloan School here at MIT. And there was a lot of kind of talking about the need for heroic leadership and dramatic intervention and so forth, but there was absolutely no explanation of where this Army, or in his case Navy, since he's an old Annapolis guy, where this Navy is sailing. It was a lot of rah-rah and a lot of energy, but at least to my ear, I kept saying, right, but what's the purpose of General Motors beyond, they're going to sell you a Volt? So I think that's the great challenge, and that's not an easy one. As I say, transformational leadership is a lot bigger thing than people perhaps think, that I think you really do have to restate an organization's purpose and its relation to its customers and what customer problems it's going to solve better than anyone else can solve them. To be truly successful for the long term. Sloan did that between 1919 and the mid-1920s. He was there until 55. I would say the system started to grind down after Sloan left, and then it did get revitalized a bit after 2000. So, look, they're okay. They're going to do okay for a while. But if they're going to go back to being that real exemplar of corporate performance that they were for about 60 years, I think they've got to have a better statement of what their purpose is that customers can hear and understand, which will make customers willing to pay more for products in a very crowded market than they probably are willing to pay for GM products right now.
So let's shift now and talk about Toyota. One of your essays in the book Gimbal Walks is called How Toyota Won and How Toyota Can Lose, from a couple years back. And there's some people that would give you some credit in a way for predicting perhaps some of the problems that Toyota has run into with its growth and allegations of quality problems. But now, considering that the NASA report has come out more or less clearing Toyota for some of those problems and allegations, and I think we have a little clearer picture of what happened there, what are your thoughts on Toyota's situation and future?
Toyota set out to do something that was just incredibly bold, which was to go out into a world that managed its affairs in a very, very different way from Toyota, and to teach an enormous number of people who actually had been trained to manage in a very different way how to embrace a new form of management. That is a very bold thing to do. out of a country that, when I first started going to Japan in 71, had modest language skills, very inward-looking, not very comfortable out on the world stage, certainly not very comfortable designing or producing abroad. So what an amazing march to go out across the world to become the world's largest car company and largest manufacturing company, to do that in a relatively brief span of time, particularly after the late 1990s when they decided to really go for the brass ring and to displace GM as the world's largest manufacturing company. So that was a very, very bold thing to do in a company that we're used to think of as being very cautious and plodding. And that was a conscious decision they made. And I think we could all now agree that that was a little bit further than they perhaps should have aimed for. So they got into a situation as I observed it. And look, unlike many people in the lean community who spend a lot of time around Toyota, I really don't. I never lived in Detroit, and I never lived with the transplants. I've always felt I'm more useful being an outsider, being an outside observer. And because Toyota, by the way, did so many good things for so many years, everybody presumed that I was just practically on the payroll at Toyota. Absolutely not. I never received any money at all from Toyota. And by the way, they were never particularly nice to me. It was always hard work to get them to tell me anything. But as the outsider, who was still pretty highly informed, I could just see that the faster they expanded, the thinner the management was in terms of true understanding of the core Toyota ideas about how to create value. And I also knew that was going to be trouble, because it is going to be trouble if you lose control of your management philosophy and you're just teaching it abstractly by telling your employees to go read books rather than teaching it by example over an extended period. Well, eventually you're going to run off the road or hit the wall or something. So you didn't have to be terribly clairvoyant back in 2006-07 as the system really reached its peak, just expanding at a staggering rate. It was one year, I forget which year, they grew their sales by $20 billion. I mean, can you imagine $20 billion in a year increasing manufacturing sales when, a large fraction of that is from Toyota or their core supplier group? That's just a staggering amount of capacity and a staggering amount of new managers and workers to add to a system. So the further they went and the faster they went, I said, my gosh, this is now a very creaky mechanism. And at some point, something bad's going to happen, and they're going to go off the road. And I didn't know when. By the way, I had absolutely no notion. And this business with the uncommanded, unintended, unexpected, whatever acceleration really was just a random event. That you had an American cabinet secretary who needed to endear himself to his president from an opposite party. You had a bunch of very confusing and noisy data based on this weblog that was created in response to the Ford Expedition Firestone Tire issue a decade ago, where anybody could go to the web and log an incident in a vehicle without even having to give a VIN number. And then that stuff's all visible out there for people to see. So that's the world, however, you live in as a consumer products company. Just ask Johnson & Johnson. This is not about cars. This is about being a consumer products business in a world that demands a whole lot of transparency in a way without doing any verification of the fact that all of the items being listed so transparently are actually real. So, however, that's play it where it lies. So, therefore, the timing of their problem was completely accidental. And look, it could have happened 3 years later. It could have happened 2 years earlier. But I think that they were going to have some problems was not something that was just an accident. I think there was almost a deterministic quality about that. By the way, this is the best thing that ever happened to Toyota, that it gives them a cause for hindsight, for critical self-reflection, and they're doing a lot of that. And Akio Toyoda, after a very shaky start, you really shouldn't hide from the media in a foreign country. You really ought to go to Washington and take your medicine. I think is serious about saying, let's get back to those basic values. But having said that, I think it takes years to teach managers how not just to think, but to behave consistently under pressure in times of difficulty, consistent with Toyota's management philosophy. And I don't think there's really a shortcut to that. And by the way, it's one-on-one teaching. It's in some ways very old-fashioned. It's master-apprentice, sensei deshi, as we would say. It just takes time. It takes a lot of A3s to create a new lean manager. So I think there's an inherent do-not-exceed speed with regard to their ability to expand. And look, let's say that we don't absolutely have the data yet that a company of that size really can teach its management system to enough managers to get consistently brilliant performance. We just don't know. They don't know. So an experiment is now being run to see just how big a company growing how fast is really possible. And the data from the last year or two is that you can't go as fast, and you're not likely to teach as effectively as you would hope. So that's where they are. Hey, by the way, they're still here as the world's largest car company. I have to think they just are delighted every time they hear Dr. Piek at Volkswagen say that he's going to pass them to become the world's largest car company, because that is an objective, let me just be very clear, that is of no use to any customer. No customer cares whether they're buying a car from the world's largest car company. So how is management think they are solving customer problems by embracing that as their objective? It's just arrogance and hubris. And then hubris, if you're lucky, leads to Hansei. Or lucky, I mean, if you've got a brain in your head. I guess if you don't have any willingness to do Hansei, well, hubris just takes you right over the falls.
So, Jim, one other question I wanted to ask, and it's a question that has come in from a number of people via the web, is to maybe practice some Hansei reflection about the term lean. And on page 227 of Gemba Walks, you reflect a bit on the term lean, which of course came out of the work from your MIT research team. So some 20 years later, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the word and what it represents.
Well, look, the word's always been problematic. What word do you pick? The word was a label, and labels are always, well, superficial. We came up with that term in '87 when we needed a name for what we were seeing. By the way, just an aside, on the MIT project, we did something that most academics don't do. Instead of doing a survey of development in manufacturing, performance in manufacturing, product development, supplier management, and then just take the data that comes back and spend endless hours regressing it against everything and doing all kinds of statistical manipulations, we decided from the outset that we would go out and verify every number by walking the Gemba. And so that gave us a enormously powerful set of insights about what was really going on, that we were benchmarking performance, but then we were trying to trace it back to methods, techniques, what managers and employees were doing. So we had set out to look at every car and light truck assembly plant in the world. We never got all of them, but we got most of them. And John Kravchuk and John Paul McDuffie and others were out verifying every number in every plant. So by '87 and certainly by '88, we had some very compelling evidence that Toyota and Honda, who were typically the star performers, Mazda as well did well on our surveys, really were in a different place from the American and European companies in terms of their ability to get products to market quickly and accurately, in terms of their ability to make things with low hours of effort, with low defects, with low inventories, with low capex. And so we needed a name for it. And this whole situation as of the mid-'80s was a Japan versus the world thing, which we thought was just a complete misunderstanding of what was going on. It was not about Japan. It was about a different management system, which really only Toyota and Honda had fully mastered, and Toyota and Mazda was copying. So what to call this system? I mean, you don't call it Onoism for Taiichi Ono, or Nakamuraism for Kinya Nakamura, the guy who invented the chief engineer system at Toyota. You're going to call it Toyotaism when Honda does it, Mazda does it. You're going to call it Toyodaism for Eiji Toyota and the family. All of those labels just seemed wrong, and yet we needed to call it something. So the term mass production was out there. I wish we had probably used the term modern production or modern management, but we weren't quite into postmodern at that point. We said this is a contrast. On every dimension, it's just different, so what do we call it? And we had a session in the office at MIT in the big boiler room where I had all the young people who had come out of industry, came back to MIT to get some additional credentials. And there are probably a dozen of us sitting there, and I don't even remember who all, John Paul McDuffie and Kravchik and Joseph Farrell from Brazil and Richard Lamming from the UK and Toshi Nishiguchi from Japan. And all of the young people, these were all kind of late 20s, maybe early 30s, but probably late 20s young people. Kravchik wasn't even that old. We're sitting there one afternoon saying, we got to have a name for this thing. What are we going to call it? Because we were getting ready to do some publishing. And so what do we do? So it was agreed we should label it for what it did. So I remember holding the chalk at the whiteboard. You don't hold chalk at a whiteboard. I had my marker at the whiteboard, and said, okay, so it uses less time, right? Less time to go from concept to launch, less time to go from raw material to customer, and it uses less effort, right? Less hours of engineering to do product development, less hours of human effort in the factory. And there are fewer suppliers, right? Fewer suppliers. And there are fewer injuries. Well, there actually were. And there's less inventory. Well, yeah, there was. And there are fewer defects, less defects. And, by the way, you can make money at lower volume because of the ability to flexibly change over from one product to another. Less. And so then John got his moment of fame, John Kravchik, by saying, I've got it, let's call it Lean. So I remember writing on the blackboard, L-E-A-N. And, of course, the problem is that lean rhymes with mean. Lean rhymes with mean. Now, lean also rhymes with green. So, hey, I don't know, maybe there's something there. But the biggest problem with the term is it's about less. And, of course, what we meant was you create more value with less of everything. And the more value sort of got lost. And that's a great shame. So what's the word we should have used that in one word captures more value, more customer problems solved, happier customers, better experience, work experience for the people who are creating the value, and then less. So it more value, better experience, less of everything. Don't know what that word is, didn't know it then, don't know it now. And so we settled on lean, and here we are.
One other question that also came in from people over the web talking about terms and methods. Curious to hear what your thoughts are on the packaging of Lean and Six Sigma, or Lean Sigma, if you will.
Well, first off, the problem, of course, is training companies. Organizations spend a tremendous amount of money on training. Most advanced countries spend a tremendous amount of money on education, and I'm skeptical that an awful lot of it makes any difference. Because simply training people to do something, when it's disconnected from what managers are going to ask them to do, or what the fundamental work requires them to do, is not likely to be very effective. So any program, whether you want to call it Lean Sigma or Sigma Lean, or how about 8 Sigma and really lean, 9 Sigma and hyper, perfectly lean, 0 Muda, whatever you want to call it. I've just got my problems right there when you've got a program and a label. But then on the other side, all of these ways of thinking, these isms that are out there that you get from total productive maintenance, and you get from Six Sigma, and you get from Lean, and you could think of lots more. Basically, everybody who's out here trying to do this is trying to figure out how to create the perfect process that creates perfect value with the least possible resources. Okay, so you're trying to create perfect value with the least resources. And these are all different starting points on how to do that. That the Six Sigma folks started with variation. In other words, with process capability. Okay? Now, when you look at what people are really doing with their DMAIC projects, well, it's all kinds of stuff, much of which often just looks not different from Lean. When you look at TPM, which started out as a machine equipment availability exercise, but then they changed the name to total productive maintenance to try to get your head off of maintenance and into productive. And you look at the good people in the TPM training world, and they're telling you to look at the whole picture. The lean guys were trying to figure out how to basically take the wasted steps out by reorganizing things in process sequence, and how to make every step capable and available, and how to make it adequate. And there's another interesting discussion with the theory of constraints folks. Hey, we need adequacy. We don't need bottlenecks. So therefore, they're part of the conversation as well. You put it all together, and in some big picture way, everybody in the process improvement, continuous improvement area is trying to do the same thing. A little bit different focus, a little bit different emphasis on this versus that. And so therefore, the conflicts between these, I think, are often basically driven by consultants whose best form of advertising is to diss whoever came before. And you really do see an awful lot of negative advertising in the consulting world that long ago ceased to shock me, but I still think it's sad. So a lot of the supposed conflict between, let's say, Lean and Six Sigma is just completely imaginary and non-existent, and it's just driven by consultants who feel more comfortable with one approach or another. And it's a big distraction. So I always say, hey, look, we're all trying to create the process which provides perfect value with zero resources. Let us cheerfully proceed together. We're going to use slightly different methods to get started and to do this and that and the other. But much of the supposed conflict here is just really made up. But having said all that, no amount of training is going to make much difference if you don't change the way managers behave and the way the work is organized. So, therefore, it's a bigger problem way beyond any conflicts within the different isms amongst the process improvers.
Well, Jim, thanks for taking your time to share thoughts on General Motors, Toyota, the word Lean, Lean Six Sigma. I want to thank you, and as we'll get more used to saying, Jim Womack, Senior Advisor to the Lean Enterprise Institute. Thank you.
Hey, look, Mark, it's been fun, and it's not over yet. That this is really a long, long thing, that in the book I have a lean walk-through history exercise that goes all the way back to the Venetian Arsenal, where they literally pioneered flow production by floating the boats down an assembly line. But good grief, what were the Chinese up to when they built the treasure ships in 1421? What were the Romans up to with all those gazillion identical wine jugs and the boats that sunk in the Mediterranean? What were the Greeks up to? This is a long history of human beings trying to think creatively about process and trying to improve process. We've been at it for a couple of thousand years. We've been at it really seriously for a century, because I think Henry Ford was the first really systematic process lean thinker. I think a lot more people have got their head in the game now, but it's a big game. And there's just an enormous amount to do, so the notion that we're going to be through this year, next, or the year after is laughable. That we're ever going to be through it all, though, I think is to look at it the wrong way. That I think this journey really does have a destination. The fact that none of us personally are going to get there is one thing, but that doesn't mean there still isn't a destination. And look, I think we're making steady, stumbling progress along the way, and my role has been to be the outsider, because I'm always an outsider. I'm never an insider. The guy who's just out there taking a walk, pointing out a different way to think about reality, or maybe just a way to think about reality or to see reality. And so therefore it's been a great journey for me. I don't feel I'm nearly finished, but even when I am finished, well, then there are just more people who need to get on the journey. And gradually, one of these eons, we might even get there, but it'll be a long time, so let's keep on keeping on.
Well, thanks for supporting your fellow stumblers like myself and the others that are listening, Jim.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily,